They mocked the Amish man for buying an obese bride, laughing as he led her through the snow. But while others saw shame, he saw something they'd long forgotten: mercy. When a blizzard hit and the town froze, it was the woman they scorned who fed them, tended their sick, and prayed for their souls. As spring came, greedy railroad men marked his land for stealing, and the same voices that jeered whispered lies to drive them out. Yet when fire and famine fell, when the town's wells ran dry, only one spring still flowed, the spring beneath the blacksmith's forge, guarded by the woman they'd despised. Now the people who mocked must kneel before the mercy they once rejected. Will pride let them die of thirst? Or will they finally beg forgiveness from the woman they called a fool's bride? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late November wind howled across the empty streets of Rock Creek Junction, rattling the loose boards of the general store's porch, where 24 women huddled. Their thin shawls offered little protection from the biting cold. The auction bell clanged harsh and hollow in the gathering dusk. Grace Haskell pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself smaller, despite knowing it was impossible. Her heart hammered against her ribs as man after man stepped forward, bidding on the drought-displaced women like cattle. The sound of coins hitting the wooden collection plate mixed with coarse laughter and crude remarks. "Next up," the auctioneer drawled, grabbing Grace's arm roughly. "Seamstress from St. Louis, healthy enough to work hard." His emphasis on healthy drew snickers from the crowd of men, their eyes cutting into Grace like knives. She fixed her gaze on her worn boots, cheeks burning. The familiar shame wrapped around her like a lead blanket. Back in St. Louis, her former fiancé's words still echoed. "I can't marry a woman twice my size." Now here she stood, being sold for labor because her savings had run dry. $1, came a slurred voice from the crowd. $1.50, called another, followed by more laughter. The wind gusted harder, carrying the first few snowflakes. Grace shivered, both from cold and humiliation. Then a quiet voice cut through the jeers. $3. The crowd parted, revealing a tall man in plain dark clothes and a broad-brimmed hat. His beard was neat, his eyes steady and calm. Grace recognized him as one of the Amish settlers who sometimes came to town for supplies. "Well now," the auctioneer said, "looks like our plain friend here wants himself a mountain." More laughter erupted, but the Amish man's expression didn't change. $3, he repeated firmly, already counting out the coins. No one outbid him. Why would they? Grace thought bitterly. But when the man approached, his manner was gentle. He held out his hand, calloused from work but steady. "I am Jacob Yoder," he said simply. Grace placed her trembling hand in his, surprised by its warmth. Without another word, he led her to a wagon waiting at the edge of town. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, then wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders before climbing up himself. The wagon creaked into motion. Snow was falling steadily now, dusting the pine trees that lined the road leading east. Grace sat rigid, hands clutched in her lap, stealing glances at the quiet man beside her. His profile was strong, somehow both stern and kind. "I don't expect kindness," she finally whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I know what I am." Jacob was silent for several long moments, only the clip-clop of the horse's hooves and the wheels' crunch through gathering snow filling the air. "You are a child of God," he said at last, his voice low but clear. "You'll have peace if I can help it." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes, but she blinked them away before they could freeze on her cheeks. The wagon rolled on through the thickening storm, leaving the town's judgments behind. After nearly an hour, an orange glow appeared through the swirling snow. As they drew closer, Grace made out a small cabin with a larger workshop beside it. Smoke curled from both chimneys, and lamplight spilled warm and welcoming from the windows. Jacob drew the wagon to a stop beneath a simple shelter. He climbed down and came around to help Grace, his strong hand steady as she descended. The snow was falling heavily now, the wind driving it sideways. "The forge keeps the house warm," Jacob explained, leading her toward the cabin's door. A blast of blessed heat met them as they stepped inside. The main room was simple but tidy, with a cook stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a rocking chair near the hearth. Everything was plain but well made, speaking of careful craftsmanship. Grace stood just inside the door, snow melting from her shawl to pool at her feet. She had never felt more out of place, yet something in the cabin's quiet dignity called to her soul. Jacob moved around the room, lighting additional lamps against the early winter dark. "I know this isn't what you would have chosen," he said, turning to face her. His eyes were kind but direct. "But here, you will be treated with respect. No one will mock you or harm you. You have my word on that." Grace's throat tightened at his simple declaration. Outside, the storm howled, but inside this humble cabin she felt the first stirring of something she had almost forgotten: hope. The blizzard howled through the night, piling snow against Jacob's cabin until morning revealed drifts tall as a man's shoulder. Grace woke to the sound of dripping near the window. Without a word, she gathered rags from her sewing kit and pressed them into the leaking spots where snow had worked its way through the aging boards. Jacob looked up from stoking the stove, surprise flickering across his usually calm face. "You needn't trouble yourself," he said quietly. "Seems to me trouble's already here," Grace replied, managing a small smile. "Might as well face it together." The day passed in a dance of careful movements around each other in the small space. Grace found flour and lard in the pantry and set about making biscuits, the familiar work steadying her hands. The smell of baking bread filled the cabin, almost drowning out the storm's rage. Near sunset, Jacob returned from checking his animals, worry creasing his brow. "The draft horse, Daniel. He's favoring his leg. Cut himself on some ice." Grace followed him to the barn, clutching her shawl against the bitter wind. The big horse stood uneasily in his stall, a nasty gash visible on his rear leg. Without hesitation, she removed her shawl and tore strips from its hem. "My mother was a healer," she explained, cleaning the wound with snow-melted water. "Taught me a thing or two about doctoring." Her gentle hands wrapped the makeshift bandage, while Jacob held the lantern, their breath visible in the cold air. Back in the cabin, silence settled between them like another blanket of snow. Jacob read from his worn Bible each evening, his voice steady and sure as he shared stories of mercy and redemption. Grace listened, letting the familiar words wash over her while she mended clothes by lamplight. On the third morning, pounding at the door startled them both. 3 men from neighboring farms stood there, desperation in their eyes. Their families were running out of firewood, and their pot-bellied stoves were failing in the brutal cold. Jacob didn't hesitate. "The forge still burns," he said, already pulling on his heavy work coat. "We'll make what's needed." Grace watched in wonder as Jacob transformed scrap metal into vital stove parts, his hammer ringing against the anvil while snow continued to fall outside. More neighbors arrived, drawn by word of mouth and necessity. Without being asked, Grace set about making a huge pot of bean soup, adding the last of her carefully hoarded vegetables from St. Louis. "Reckon we're blessed to have you here," one of the men said gruffly as she handed him a steaming bowl. The others nodded, their earlier mockery forgotten in the face of her quiet competence and gentle humor. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she replied, her cheeks pink from more than just the kitchen's heat. For hours, Jacob worked the forge while Grace fed the hungry men. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, and gradually the sharp edges of judgment began to soften. When one man started to make a crude joke about her size, another elbowed him to silence. "That woman's keeping us from freezing," he muttered. "Show some respect." Finally, the storm began to ease. The sky cleared to reveal a world transformed into crystalline white. As soon as the roads were passable, Jacob hitched Daniel, now healing well, to the wagon and loaded it with repaired pots and stove parts for delivery to town. Grace sat beside him on the wagon seat, chin held high despite her racing heart. Rock Creek Junction looked different somehow, its harsh edges smoothed by deep snow. People who had laughed at the auction now hurried past with averted eyes, shame written in their hurried steps. Outside the general store, Mrs. Peterson, the shopkeeper's wife who had been particularly cruel, stopped short at the sight of Grace helping to unload the wagon. "I hear tell you helped save half the county from freezing," she said stiffly. "Just did what needed doing," Grace replied evenly, though her hands trembled slightly as she stacked the mended pots. Jacob worked quietly beside her, acknowledging the townspeople's awkward nods with simple dignity. When their deliveries were complete, he helped Grace back into the wagon without ceremony. The sun caught the snowdrifts as they headed home, making them sparkle like diamonds. Or perhaps like mercy, Grace thought, remembering Jacob's Bible readings. Neither spoke during the ride home, but the silence between them had changed, becoming comfortable as a well-worn quilt. The forge's smoke rose straight and true against the blue sky, beckoning them back to the place where respect had begun to take root, as steady and sure as the winter wheat sleeping beneath the snow. The following week brought warmer winds that turned pristine snowdrifts into treacherous mud. Inside Jacob's forge, heat blazed from the hearth as he showed Grace how to handle the heavy tools of his trade. Her fingers traced the neat columns in his leather-bound accounts ledger, while morning light streamed through the workshop's single window. "Each service must be recorded," Jacob explained, his voice steady and patient. "God expects honest dealings." He demonstrated how to note payment for horseshoes and wagon repairs in careful script. Grace nodded, studying the precise numbers. "I can help with this. My boarding school years weren't entirely wasted." She reached for the pencil, then hesitated. "I want to pay my way, Jacob, through honest work." Jacob's expression softened as he looked at her. "You're no servant here," he said quietly, "but I won't deny you the dignity of labor." Together they stepped out into the muddy yard, where early spring sunshine warmed their faces. Jacob led a neighbor's mare into the forge, showing Grace how to gentle the nervous animal. His strong hands demonstrated the proper way to lift each hoof, clean it, and prepare it for shoeing. "The secret is in the patience," he explained, heating an iron shoe in the forge until it glowed cherry red. "Horse and smith must trust each other." Grace watched intently as Jacob shaped the metal with practiced strikes, the anvil ringing like a bell. When he offered her the hammer to try a simple bend, she gripped it with determination, despite her trembling hands. Later that afternoon, they walked to the kitchen garden where patches of earth showed through melting snow. Jacob handed Grace a packet of onion sets and another of winter cabbage seeds. They worked side by side, turning the rich soil and planting straight rows. "The earth doesn't judge," Grace said softly, pressing seeds into the damp ground. "It only asks for care and attention." Each morning began with breakfast and Bible reading. Jacob's steady voice filling the kitchen with ancient words of wisdom and comfort. Grace found herself looking forward to these quiet moments, when the day's work waited while they shared coffee and reflection. One particularly warm day found them on the barn roof, replacing weather-worn shingles. Grace proved stronger than she looked, hauling bundles of cedar shakes up the ladder without complaint. Jacob showed her how to overlap each piece properly to keep out rain. "You have a good eye for this work," he commented as she lined up another row perfectly straight. Before Grace could respond, the clip-clop of approaching hooves announced visitors. 3 Amish families from the settlement pulled up in their buggies, curiosity evident on their faces as they spotted Grace on the roof. Heat flooded her cheeks as she climbed down, painfully aware of her mud-stained skirts and practical work boots. These women wore pristine black dresses and spotless white caps. They had come to see Jacob's marriage by purchase, the topic of much whispered discussion in their community. Fighting her embarrassment, Grace straightened her shoulders. "Please, come inside for tea," she offered, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I baked a fresh apple pie this morning." The visitors followed her into the kitchen, where she busied herself with cups and saucers while they spoke quietly in Pennsylvania Dutch. Jacob joined them, exchanging greetings with the men while Grace served her pie. One of the women, Sarah Stoltzfus, drew Grace aside as the others talked. "Your coming has caused much talk," she whispered, "but Jacob's charity shames those who would have left you to winter's mercy. Remember that." That night, after their guests had gone, Grace sat alone by the kitchen window. Silent tears tracked down her cheeks as she remembered the measuring looks, the whispered comments. She had thought to escape judgment by coming west, only to find it waiting here too. The creak of floorboards announced Jacob's approach. He knelt by the hearth for evening prayers, his voice warm in the gathering darkness. "Lord, we thank you for your many blessings," he prayed, "for the strength of honest work, for the bounty of your earth, and most especially for sending a helper fit for the burden of this life. Amen." Grace wiped her eyes, touched by his words. Before dawn the next morning, she was already in the barn, determination lending strength to her movements as she milked the cows. The familiar rhythm of the work steadied her spirit. She might not fit the image of an Amish wife, but she would earn her place here through deed and devotion. As the sun rose over Jacob's land, their land now, Grace squared her shoulders and carried the fresh milk toward the house. One day at a time, she would prove herself worthy of the chance she'd been given. Spring painted the Wyoming countryside in subtle shades of green and gold. Tender grass pushed through melting snow, and the creek ran high with mountain runoff. At Jacob's forge, the rhythms of honest work filled each day with purpose, until the surveyors came. Their arrival brought the sharp scent of cigar smoke, drifting across meadows where wildflowers had just begun to bloom. Men in crisp suits drove stakes into the ground, squinting through brass instruments and making marks in leather-bound notebooks. Grace watched them from the kitchen window while kneading bread dough. "Jacob," she called softly when he came in for water. "They're getting closer to the spring." Before Jacob could respond, hoofbeats announced visitors. A well-dressed man rode up on a gleaming bay horse, followed by 2 others. His silver watch chain glinted in the morning sun as he dismounted. "Clive Denton," he announced, not waiting for a greeting. "Railroad land acquisition." His eyes swept over Jacob's plain clothes with barely hidden disdain. "We're planning a spur line through these parts. Progress is coming to Rock Creek Junction." Jacob wiped his hands on his leather apron. "Welcome to our home, Mr. Denton. Would you care for coffee?" Denton's lip curled as Grace stepped onto the porch. "Ah, the forge's fat guardian. No coffee needed. He pulled a document from his coat. $20 for the homestead. That's generous, considering. Considering what? Grace asked, her voice tight. Considering you're squatting on land already promised to the railroad. Denton's smile didn't reach his eyes. This territory needs development, not backwards farmers in funny clothes. Jacob's expression remained calm, though Grace saw his hands clench slightly. We cannot sell. This land feeds our neighbors and waters their stock. It would not be right. Right, Denton laughed harshly. Progress doesn't care about your conscience, Mr. Yoder. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. He turned on his heel, pausing only to hammer another wooden stake near the bubbling spring that fed Jacob's Creek. The water there ran sweet and clear all year, a rare blessing in the high country. Grace watched the surveyors work their way across their pasture. They act like they own it already, she whispered. They own only what we give them, Jacob replied quietly. God gave us this land to tend. We must be faithful to that trust. A week passed. Grace made her weekly trip into town for supplies, trying to ignore the whispers that followed her through the mercantile. Near the loading dock, she overheard 3 men talking, their voices carrying clearly in the spring air. Denton's got it all arranged, one said, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Government'll condemn that Amish land for development. Simple as that. About time, another agreed. Can't let good water go to waste on folk who won't even fight for it. Grace's hands trembled as she loaded her purchases into the wagon. Back home, she found Jacob in the forge, working steady at his anvil. They mean to take it, she burst out. The railroad has friends in government. We have to fight back. Jacob set down his hammer and turned to face her. We fight only by standing firm, he said gently. Violence breeds violence, but truth stands like bedrock. Grace opened her mouth to argue, but movement near the barn caught her eye. A young man in a deputy's badge approached on foot, leading his horse. His plain clothes and careful manner spoke of Amish upbringing, though he now carried a gun at his hip. Samuel Ridge, Jacob greeted him. You've come far today. The deputy nodded. Far enough to learn things that need telling. He glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. Denton's papers are forged. He's done this before, using false documents to steal land, then selling it to the railroad at a profit. Can you prove this? Grace asked eagerly. Samuel shook his head. Not yet. But I'm watching. Thought you should know to be careful. Denton's not above using force when fraud fails. Jacob thanked him with quiet dignity. They watched the young deputy ride away, his straight back a reminder of the bridge he walked between 2 worlds. That evening, Jacob checked every lock on the barn and storehouse. Grace saw him slip the account books and property deed into the family Bible for safekeeping. Outside their window, the stake near their spring cast a long shadow in the setting sun. What do we do now? Grace asked softly. Jacob's weathered hands were gentle as he lit the evening lamp. We continue our work. We treat all with kindness, and we trust that light will overcome darkness, as it always has. Grace nodded, drawing strength from his steadfast faith. But she kept the kitchen knife closer at hand when she worked, and found herself watching the road more carefully for dust clouds that might herald trouble. The warm spring days brought more than just wildflowers to Rock Creek Junction. Whispers sprouted like weeds, poisoning the air with cruel invention. Grace first heard the rumors when she went to fetch supplies at the general store. That's her, the witch who bathes in the sacred spring, a woman hissed, pulling her children away, cursing good Christian land with her heathen ways. Grace's hands trembled as she gathered her purchases. She recognized the voice as belonging to one of Denton's men's wives. The lie spread quickly through town, carried on winds of fear and prejudice. The next morning, the crack of stones against their fence posts startled Grace from her washing. 3 boys, faces twisted with manufactured hate, lobbed rocks toward their property. One stone struck the water barrel, sending a spray of splinters into the air. "Witch, go back where you came from," they shouted before running away. Grace's chest tightened as she gathered the scattered laundry. The fresh sheets were now spotted with mud, but it was her heart that felt stained. Sunday brought no relief. The little white church at the edge of town had always welcomed everyone, even plain folk like Jacob. But today, Preacher Elias Booth's eyes skated past them as if they were ghosts. His sermon spoke of evil influences and standing firm against wickedness. With each word, Grace felt herself shrinking smaller in the hard wooden pew. That evening, Jacob worked late in his forge. The steady ring of metal on metal filled the darkness as he sharpened plowshares. Grace sat by the window, letting quiet tears fall as she mended one of his shirts. She thought she had hidden her grief well, but Jacob's soft voice carried from the doorway. "God hears lies," he said simply, hanging up his leather apron. "He also corrects them." Grace wiped her eyes with her apron. How can he correct what people choose to believe? "By giving us chances to show his truth through love," Jacob answered, settling into his chair by the fire. "That's all he asks of us." Grace took his words to heart. The next day, when dusty travelers stopped to water their horses, she offered fresh bread and coffee. When Mr. Peterson's mare went lame 2 miles from town, Grace helped Jacob tend to her through the afternoon, applying cool compresses and herbs she'd learned from her mother. Word of her kindness spread as quietly as the rumors had, but with deeper roots. Then came the night that changed everything. Urgent pounding at their door broke the evening silence. Sarah Miller stood there, cradling her young son, Thomas. The boy's face burned with fever, his breathing labored and shallow. "The doctor's away," Sarah gasped, desperation overwhelming her previous disdain for Grace. "Please, he's burning up." Grace didn't hesitate. She took the boy into her arms, feeling the heat radiating from his small body. "Jacob, we'll need cool water from the spring, and fetch my herb chest." Through the long night, Grace sat with Thomas. She bathed his forehead with spring water, spooned honey and herb tea between his cracked lips, and sang soft hymns when he grew restless. Sarah watched from the corner, her earlier prejudice forgotten in maternal fear. As dawn painted the eastern sky in pearl and rose, Thomas's fever broke. His breathing eased, and color returned to his cheeks. Sarah burst into tears when he opened his eyes and asked for water. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered to Grace. "After how we treated you." Grace squeezed her hand. "There's no debt between neighbors who help each other." The next morning, Sarah returned with fresh-baked bread and shame in her eyes. "The things people said about you. The things I believed." She couldn't finish. "It's behind us now," Grace assured her, accepting the bread with a smile. Though her heart still carried scars from the cruel words, she chose to let love heal what bitterness would only deepen. That simple loaf of bread marked a turning point. Slowly, other townspeople began to question the rumors they'd so readily believed. They saw Grace's gentle ways with injured animals, her generosity to travelers, her quiet strength in the face of scorn. The children who had thrown stones now waved shyly when she passed. Jacob watched this transformation with quiet satisfaction. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the creek in gold, he took her hand. "See how truth rises?" he asked softly. Like cream and fresh milk. Grace nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes, not from pain this time, but from the profound grace of forgiveness. The spring bubbled nearby, its waters pure and sweet, just as they had always been. The warm June sunshine bathed Rock Creek Valley in golden light as Jacob and Grace stood at the edge of their fields. The morning dew had burned away, leaving the earth dry and thirsting. All around them, the land showed signs of the continuing drought. Brown grass bent in the breeze, and dust devils danced across the packed soil. "The spring gives more than we need," Jacob said quietly, studying the parcels he'd marked out with wooden stakes. "It ain't right to hoard water when others go without." Grace nodded, wiping her brow with her apron. "How many families do you reckon we can help?" "Maybe 8, if we divide it proper." Jacob adjusted his broad-brimmed hat. "But we'll need something written to keep things fair." Deputy Samuel Ridge arrived later that morning, his leather satchel tucked under one arm. The young lawman's face brightened at the sight of Grace's fresh-baked bread cooling on the windowsill. "Much obliged for the help, Samuel," Jacob said, leading him to the kitchen table where they could work. Samuel spread out clean paper and dipped his pen in ink. "A proper lease will protect everyone," he explained, carefully drafting the agreement. 5 acres per family, water rights from sunup to sundown, shared maintenance of the irrigation ditches. Grace served them coffee as they worked, listening to the scratch of Samuel's pen and the gentle murmur of their voices. The simple document took shape. Clear terms, fair expectations, and space for signatures. Word spread quickly through town. By afternoon, families began arriving at the homestead, hope written plain on their tired faces. Jacob walked each group through their assigned plot, showing them where to dig the shallow channels that would carry life-giving water to their crops. "The soil's good here," he explained, crumbling rich black earth between his fingers. "Just needs water and careful tending." One by one, the families signed Samuel's lease. Their gratitude showed in firm handshakes and misty eyes. Even those who had once whispered against Grace now smiled and called her neighbor. As summer deepened, the shared fields came alive. Corn stalks reached toward the sky, their leaves rustling in the warm breeze. Bean vines climbed sturdy poles, and squash plants sprawled between the rows. Jacob spent his mornings in the forge, but dedicated his afternoons to teaching the children how to mend broken tools. "See here," he would say, showing them how to reshape a bent hoe blade or replace a broken handle. Tools are like people. They work best when they're cared for proper. Grace found her own way to help. In the cool of the evening, she gathered the mothers in her kitchen, teaching them to stretch their dwindling supplies. "Cornmeal makes fine bread," she demonstrated, her capable hands kneading the golden dough. "Add a spoonful of honey, and even the little ones won't miss the wheat flour." The railroad men who had once swaggered through town grew quieter, less visible. Even Clive Denton's swagger seemed subdued when he passed the thriving community fields. But Jacob noticed how the man's eyes lingered on the spring, calculating and cold. One peaceful evening, Jacob and Grace sat on their porch, listening to the chorus of frogs down by the creek. The sunset painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, while fireflies began their nightly dance above the corn. "Who'd have thought," Grace mused, her voice soft with wonder, "that sharing what we had would bring such blessing?" Jacob reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. A rare smile crossed his face as he watched lightning bugs mirror the emerging stars. For a moment, the weight of recent troubles seemed to lift from his shoulders. Their quiet laughter mingled with the evening sounds. Cricket song, the distant lowing of cattle, the gentle splash of the spring. It felt almost like the peaceful home life they'd both dreamed of, but never dared expect. Then a train whistle echoed through the valley, its lonesome wail cutting through the twilight peace. Jacob's hand tightened slightly around Grace's, and she felt the change come over him. His eyes darkened as he gazed toward the railroad tracks glinting in the distance. The whistle sounded again, closer this time, and Jacob's jaw set in a firm line. He didn't need to speak the words aloud. Grace could read the worry in his face. The railroad hadn't given up its plans. This peace they'd built, this fragile trust between neighbors, was just the calm before a greater storm. But for now, they held on to the moment, the cool evening air, the chorus of frogs, the fireflies rising like hopes in the gathering dusk. Tomorrow would bring what it would. Tonight, they had this small piece of heaven they'd created together, and the knowledge that they'd used it to help their neighbors find hope again. Grace jolted awake at midnight, her heart pounding. Something was wrong. The air in their small bedroom felt thick, and an acrid smell burned her throat. Smoke. "Jacob!" she cried, shaking him awake. "Fire!" They rushed to the window. Orange flames leaped from the barn roof, casting terrible shadows across their yard. The dry summer wood caught like kindling, and already the fire had taken hold of the entire eastern wall. Jacob threw on his boots and ran outside, with Grace close behind. The heat hit them like a wall as they approached the burning structure. Inside, they could hear the terrified whinnies of their trapped horses. "The animals!" Grace shouted over the roar of the flames. Jacob didn't hesitate. He rushed to the barn doors, throwing them open. Thick smoke billowed out as he disappeared inside. Grace's heart stopped, but moments later he emerged, leading 2 panicked horses by their halters. Their eyes rolled white with fear as he guided them to safety. "There are 3 more!" he called, diving back into the inferno. Grace held the rescued horses' leads with trembling hands, watching in horror as the flames climbed higher. The dry timbers crackled and popped, sending burning embers floating into the night sky like deadly fireflies. Again and again, Jacob braved the flames, bringing out horses one by one. His face was streaked with soot, and his clothes were singed, but he wouldn't stop until every animal was safe. The last horse fought him, wild with panic, but Jacob's quiet strength finally won out. But there was no saving their tools. The forge equipment, the carefully maintained wagons, the winter's store of hay, all of it burned. The heat was so intense that even the metal tools began to glow red, warping in the flames. Neighbors began arriving, drawn by the fire's glow against the night sky. They formed a bucket line from the spring, but it was too late. The barn was beyond saving. Through the chaos, Grace caught glimpses of horses disappearing into the darkness, carrying riders away from the scene. Even in the dim light, she recognized the shape of Denton's men. By dawn, only smoking ruins remained. The barn's blackened beams jutted toward the sky like accusing fingers. The acrid smell of burnt wood and metal hung heavy in the air, and ash covered everything like gray snow. Jacob said little as he hitched up their remaining wagon. His face was grim as he prepared to ride into town to file charges against Denton and his men. Grace watched him go, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. Hours passed with no word. Then, just past noon, young Samuel Ridge rode up to their homestead, his face troubled. "They've arrested Jacob," he said, removing his hat. "They're holding him on charges of obstructing government work. The warrant, it's forged, I'm sure of it, but it bears the territorial judge's seal." Grace felt the ground sway beneath her feet. She clutched Jacob's Bible to her chest. The one he read from every evening. Its familiar leather binding gave her something solid to hold on to as her world crumbled around her. "How long?" she managed to ask. "The circuit judge won't be here for 2 weeks at least," Samuel replied softly. "I'll do what I can, but—" Grace nodded, understanding what he couldn't say. The Titef law moved slowly out here, and Denton had powerful friends. As dusk approached, Grace found herself standing in the barn ruins. Ash crunched beneath her feet as she moved through what remained of their livelihood. A twisted hammer here, a melted bucket there. Each charred remnant told the story of their loss. Overwhelmed, she sank to her knees in the debris. The Bible still clutched in her hands, she began to pray aloud, her voice rough with emotion. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength to fight this battle gently. Show me how to stand firm without becoming hard. Help me find your way through this valley." A soft lowing caught her attention. From behind a fallen beam emerged their old milk cow, Emma, limping badly. The animal had somehow survived the fire, though her hide was singed and one leg was clearly injured. With trembling hands, Grace examined the cow's wounds. As she cleaned and dressed the burns, she felt something change inside her. A steely resolve began to take root where fear and grief had been. "We'll make it through this," she told Emma softly, her gentle touches belying the hardness growing in her eyes. "Those men think they can burn us out, break us down, but they don't know what it means to survive." The sun set over the smoking ruins, painting the sky in shades of flame. Grace stood watch over their remaining animals, Jacob's Bible tucked securely in her apron pocket. She had started this year as a woman nobody wanted, sold at auction. Now she stood as a woman with purpose, preparing to fight for the home and the man who had given her dignity. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Grace walked the dusty road into Rock Creek. Her dress, still stained with soot from the barn fire, hung heavy in the summer heat. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that settled on her worn boots, but she kept her chin high. Townsfolk stopped their morning routines to stare as she passed. Women on porches whispered behind their hands. Men loading wagons paused mid-task, their faces a mixture of shame and curiosity. Through it all, Grace walked steadily forward, Jacob's Bible clutched tightly in her hands. The church bell tolled, calling people to Sunday service. Grace waited until the last stragglers filed inside before following. The familiar scent of pine boards and lamp oil filled the small building. Reverend Matthews stood at his pulpit, preparing to begin his sermon as she slipped into a back pew. Sheriff Lyle sat in his usual place of honor near the front, his badge gleaming in the light from the windows. His shoulders tensed when he noticed her presence, but he didn't turn around. The Reverend cleared his throat. "Today's text speaks of—" "Excuse me, Reverend." Grace's voice carried clearly through the church, though her hands trembled. She stood, and all heads turned toward her. "Mrs. Yoder, we're about to begin service," Reverend Matthews said stiffly. "Then this is the perfect time to speak truth," Grace replied, stepping into the center aisle. Her soot-stained dress stood in stark contrast to the Sunday best surrounding her. "The Lord's house should hear it first." She walked forward, past the shocked faces of people who had laughed at her months ago. Her voice grew stronger with each step. "You all mocked Jacob Yoder for buying me at that auction, called him a fool, called me worse." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "But it wasn't Jacob who needed saving that day. The Lord sent me here to buy something far more precious, your mercy." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Sheriff Lyle shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "While you turned your backs, we opened our spring to your crops. While you spread rumors, we mended your tools and taught your children. and now Jacob sits in jail on false charges because he wouldn't bow to corruption. Grace's voice filled the church, steady despite her racing heart. Your silence makes you just as guilty as the men who burned our barn. How many pieces of silver did it take to buy that silence? The sheriff stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Every eye turned to him as he slowly unpinned his badge. $300, he said quietly. That's what Denton paid me to look the other way, to ignore the forged papers, the threats, all of it. He placed his badge on the pew beside him. I hereby resign as sheriff of Rock Creek Junction. I can't wear this badge knowing what I've done. A heavy silence fell over the church. Grace could hear the rapid beating of her own heart in her ears. But it ain't that simple, the former sheriff continued. Denton's papers still carry weight with the territorial court, whether they're forged or not. It'll take more than my confession to help Jacob. Grace nodded, having expected as much. Then let God judge between us and them. She turned to face the congregation one last time. Your crops grow with water from our spring. Your children eat bread from our flour. Remember that when Denton's men come asking for your support. With that, she walked out of the church, her head held high. No one spoke as she passed. No one tried to stop her. The walk home seemed longer under the afternoon sun. The charred remains of their barn cast long shadows across the yard as Grace approached. Without breaking stride, she gathered fallen branches and timber scraps that had survived the fire. As the sun set, she worked steadily, building a simple lean-to beside the ruined barn. Her hands, already rough from forge work, collected splinters, but she didn't stop until she had created a basic shelter. Night fell, bringing with it a blanket of stars. Grace sat beneath her makeshift roof, Jacob's Bible open in her lap. The evening breeze carried the lingering smell of smoke and ash, mingling with the sweet scent of summer grass. She bowed her head and began to pray, her words carrying softly into the darkness. Lord, give Jacob strength in his cell tonight. Give me wisdom to fight this battle your way, and if it be your will, help our neighbors find the courage to stand for what's right. The stars wheeled overhead as Grace kept her vigil, a solitary figure of quiet determination in the shadow of destruction. The first frost came early that year, coating the grass with white crystals before August had even ended. Grace stood at the window of Jacob's empty house, watching dead leaves skitter across the yard. The morning sun cast long shadows through the bare branches, a constant reminder that winter approached too soon. In town, the railroad's new spur line gleamed like a steel snake across the valley. The construction crews had finished their work weeks ago, but the victory proved hollow. Where Denton had promised prosperity, only dust remained. Grace heard the news from Samuel Ridge, who now worked as a farmhand after leaving his deputy post. He rode up one morning, his horse's hooves kicking up dry dirt from the parched earth. "The well's gone dry," he announced, dismounting. "That fancy pump station they built? Nothing but mud at the bottom." His voice carried a mix of anger and grim satisfaction. "Denton knew it would happen. That's why he wanted your spring so bad." Grace nodded slowly. "Jacob tried to warn them. Said you can't force water where God didn't put it." "Denton's gone," Samuel continued, leaning against the fence post. "Rode out 2 nights ago with his strongbox, left a dozen workers without their pay, and twice as many families who invested their savings in his promises." The news spread quickly through Rock Creek Junction. Crops withered in the fields as one stream after another dried up. Gardens turned brown, then gray. Livestock grew thin, and children carried empty water buckets home from dried-up creeks. Former Sheriff Lyle, who had taken up farming after his resignation, rode out to Jacob's forge one evening. Grace found him standing by the spring, his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, unable to meet her eyes, "I've been studying the land grants, the real ones this time. This spring," he gestured to the clear water bubbling up from beneath the forge, "it's fed by the only true aquifer in the valley. Everything else is surface water, gone with the drought." Grace offered him a dipper of water, which he accepted gratefully. "Have you heard anything about Jacob?" she asked. Lyle shook his head. "Still held at the county seat. The territorial judge is backed up with cases, and Denton's papers, forged as they are, have tied everything up in legal knots." That evening, Grace walked to each neighboring farm. She knocked on doors that had once been closed to her, speaking to faces that had once turned away in scorn. "Come pray with me," she said to each one. "The Lord hears those who humble themselves." They gathered at sunset near the spring, a ragged circle of 30 or more. Children clutched their mothers' skirts. Men removed their hats. Grace led them in prayer, her voice steady and clear in the cooling air. Days passed. The sky remained a harsh, unbroken blue. Grace watched her neighbors' suffering grow worse. She gathered what few possessions she had: Jacob's mother's silver candlesticks, her own locket with her parents' pictures, even her wedding ring from her first marriage in St. Louis. The items brought enough at the general store to buy flour and dried beans. She cooked huge pots of soup, feeding any child who came to her door. Some days she saw 20 or more small faces, their eyes grateful as they accepted bowls of thin broth. "Ain't right," Samuel said one evening, helping her clean the empty pot. "You selling your treasures to feed them has wronged you." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "The Lord says to love our enemies. Besides," she smiled faintly, "most of these folks ain't enemies anymore, just hungry neighbors who lost their way for a spell." The nights grew longer and colder. Grace spent them on her knees by Jacob's Bible, praying for rain, for justice, for her husband's return. The stars wheeled overhead, silent and bright in the drought-clear sky. Hope dimmed like a guttering candle, but refused to die completely. Grace saw it in the faces of children who still smiled when she handed them soup. She felt it in the strong arms of neighbors who helped her maintain the forge, keeping Jacob's tools ready for his return. She heard it in the quiet "thank you" from women who had once mocked her size and status. Each morning, she checked the spring, giving thanks that it still flowed clear and sweet. Each evening, she lit a lamp in the window, waiting for Jacob. The drought had stripped away pride and pretense, leaving only the bare truth. That mercy, like water, brought life to parched ground. The railroad's shining rails lay silent and useless, a monument to greed's folly. But around Jacob's spring, a different kind of wealth grew, the wealth of shared bread, joined hands, and humble prayers rising like mist in the autumn air. 3 more weeks passed without a drop of rain. Grace watched the last garden plants wither, their leaves curling like paper in the relentless sun. The spring by the forge still flowed, but it wasn't enough for all the desperate families who made the daily trek for water. One crisp morning, Grace rose before dawn. She packed cornbread, dried apples, and Jacob's old canteen into a burlap sack. Her hands moved with quiet determination as she hitched their elderly mule, Betsy, to the wooden cart. "The Lord provided one spring," she whispered, patting Betsy's gray nose. "Maybe he's got another one waiting if we just look hard enough." She left a note tacked to the forge door for Samuel, then clicked her tongue at Betsy. The cart wheels creaked as they set off northward, toward the dark line of foothills that marked the valley's edge. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, warming her back as they traveled. The first day's journey took them through familiar territory, past dried creek beds and withered cornfields. Farmers paused in their work to wave, their faces puzzled at the sight of Grace traveling alone. She waved back but didn't stop to explain. There wasn't time for talk. Winter was coming. When dusk approached, she guided Betsy beneath a stand of towering pines. The cart's worn wheels had left clear tracks in the dusty soil, easy enough to follow if anyone came looking. Grace gathered pine needles for a softer bed, then tied Betsy close by. The mule's warm bulk helped ward off the night's chill as Grace huddled beneath Jacob's old wool blanket. The second day brought steeper terrain. Grace walked beside the cart, easing Betsy's burden as they climbed. Her muscles ached, unused to such travel, but she pressed on. Sometimes she hummed hymns to keep her spirits up, the familiar tunes carrying her forward step by step. The third night was the coldest yet. Grace camped in a narrow draw, the cart's wooden sides blocking the worst of the wind. She curled close to Betsy, grateful for the mule's steady presence. Above them, stars blazed in the clear mountain air, so bright they almost hurt to look at. "Lord," Grace prayed softly, "show me where to look. These people need water, something fierce." Dawn of the fourth day broke gray and sharp. Grace's joints were stiff as she loaded the cart, but something in the air felt different. The pines grew thicker here, their branches heavy with green needles despite the drought below. Hope stirred in her chest. Near midday, she heard it, a sound so faint she thought she was imagining things at first. But no, there it was again, the whisper of running water. Grace tied Betsy to a tree and followed the sound. Her heart beat faster as she pushed through dense undergrowth. Then she saw it, a silver thread of water seeping from a crack in the granite rock face, catching sunlight as it trickled down into a small pool. Her legs gave way. She knelt beside the pool, tears mixing with the clear water as she cupped it in her hands. It tasted sweet and cold, pure as prayer. "Thank you," she whispered, over and over. "Thank you, Lord." Grace worked until sunset, gathering fallen branches and pine boughs to build a crude shelter near the spring. Her hands were scratched and sore, but satisfaction warmed her chest as she surveyed her work. It wasn't much, but it would keep the rain off when it finally came. Next, she gathered rocks to build troughs, arranging them to catch the spring's flow. Future travelers would need a place to water their horses and fill their canteens. The work was slow and heavy, but Grace didn't mind. Each stone placed felt like an act of faith. As twilight deepened into true night, she built a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the rock face, while crickets chirped in the undergrowth. Grace's voice rose soft and clear in the darkness, singing the same hymn she'd once sung in that crowded church in Rock Creek. "Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand." The melody echoed off the canyon walls, carrying far into the night. But Grace didn't know that someone else heard it. Someone who had been following her tracks for days, whose heart leaped at the sound of her voice carried on the mountain air. Jacob, finally free through Samuel's determined work with the territorial courts, was drawing closer with every step. She sang another verse, her voice growing stronger as it lifted toward the stars. The spring's gentle music accompanied her, a reminder that even in the driest places, living water could still be found. 2 mornings later, the sun had barely cleared the eastern ridges when Grace knelt beside her spring, filling water skins for the day ahead. The sound of footsteps on pine needles made her pause. She turned, shading her eyes against the morning light. There stood Jacob, trail dusty and thin, his familiar broad-brimmed hat in his hands. His eyes were wet with tears. Grace's water skin dropped forgotten to the ground. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Jacob took 3 quick steps forward, and Grace rose to meet him. They came together like 2 leaves blown by the same wind, holding each other as their shoulders shook with silent sobs. "I thought," Grace's voice broke. "I didn't know if you'd ever—" "Samuel found the proof," Jacob said softly, his voice rough from emotion. "The railroad men forged everything. The territorial judge threw out the charges once Samuel showed him the real papers." Grace pulled back just enough to study his face. New lines creased the corners of his eyes, and his beard had grown longer during his imprisonment. But his gentle strength remained unchanged. "The homestead?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. "Lost to us now. The railroad's greed poisoned that ground, but God led you here instead." He looked around at the spring-fed pool, the crude shelter, the stone troughs Grace had built. "You've done good work." "We'll do better together," Grace said firmly, wiping her eyes with her apron. They spent that first day gathering stones from the hillside, working side by side to build proper walls around Grace's shelter. Jacob's strong hands guided the rocks into place, while Grace mixed mud and pine needles for mortar. Every so often their eyes would meet, and quiet smiles would pass between them, as if reassuring themselves this wasn't a dream. By the 3rd day, word had spread about the new spring. The first travelers arrived just after dawn, a family with 3 small children, their wagon creaking under the weight of everything they owned. Grace filled their cups herself, watching joy spread across their tired faces as they tasted the sweet water. "There's space here to rest," she told them, gesturing to the clearing she'd cleaned beside the spring. "Stay as long as you need." More families followed. Jacob set up a small forge, using stones from the hillside, and soon the ring of his hammer filled the air as he repaired wagon wheels and broken tools. The travelers paid what they could, sometimes with coins, more often with food or supplies. Grace didn't turn anyone away. "The water's a gift," she would say, pressing full cups into trembling hands. "God's mercy flows freely here." Under the shade of a canvas tarp, Grace created a simple infirmary. She tended to blistered feet, sun-fevered children, and exhausted mothers. Her gentle hands and quiet humor brought comfort to those who'd lost hope on the dusty roads. Each morning, she gathered wild herbs from the hillsides to make healing teas. The spring seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. What had started as a trickle soon fed a small creek that wound down through the pines. Birds began gathering in the branches overhead, their songs joining the sound of flowing water and Jacob's steady hammer. One evening, as they sat together by their cook fire, Jacob reached for Grace's hand. "I heard you singing that night," he said softly. "Following your tracks, worried I'd lost the trail? Then your voice came floating down from these hills, clear as a bell." Grace squeezed his fingers. "I was singing to keep my courage up. Didn't know I was singing you home?" A child's laugh rang out from one of the nearby camps, followed by another. The sound startled them both. It had been so long since they'd heard such joy. Grace found herself chuckling, and Jacob's deep laugh joined in, rusty but real. "Listen to that," she said, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "Laughter's coming back to us, same as the water." Jacob nodded, his eyes bright in the firelight. "Both are signs of life returning. God's grace flows where it will." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the flames dance. Around them, the evening air filled with the sounds of families settling in for the night. Mothers singing lullabies, fathers telling stories, the peaceful nickering of horses. The spring's steady music underscored it all, a constant reminder of providence and hope. The first frost came early that year, silvering the pine needles and rimming Grace's water troughs with delicate ice. Each morning she broke the thin crystals with a stick, ensuring the spring's flow remained clear for those in need. The camp had grown steadily through autumn. Simple shelters of canvas and pine boughs dotted the hillside, smoke rising from cook fires in the crisp air. Jacob had helped the families build stone circles to contain their flames, showing them how to bank the coals at night to preserve warmth. One pale morning, Grace spotted figures stumbling up the trail from the valley, familiar faces from Rock Creek, gaunt with hunger. Their wagons creaked under the weight of everything they'd salvaged from their failing farms. Children with hollow cheeks clung to their mothers' skirts. "The wells are dry," one man explained, his voice cracking. "Nothing left to harvest. We heard tell of water in the hills." Grace filled cups from her spring without hesitation. "Drink slowly," she cautioned, supporting trembling hands. "Your bodies need time to remember abundance." Among the newcomers, Grace recognized widow Cora Hanley, who had once led the cruel gossip against her in town. The older woman stood apart from the others, pride warring with desperation on her weathered face. Grace approached her with a steaming cup of broth. "There's room by my fire," Grace said softly, pressing the cup into the widow's cold hands. "No need to stand alone in the cold." Tears spilled down Cora's cheeks. "After how I treated you," she whispered. "That was another season," Grace answered. "Winter teaches us all to share warmth." Jacob worked tirelessly among the refugees, his forge glowing late into the night as he repaired broken wagon wheels and cracked axles. When families offered payment, a handful of cornmeal, a precious egg, he would shake his head. "Keep it for your children," he would say. "The work keeps my hands warm." Deputy Samuel Ridge rode up from the county seat one afternoon, his horse's breath steaming in the chill air. He brought news that government agents had begun investigating the railroad's land fraud. "They're following Denton's paper trail east," Samuel reported, warming his hands by Grace's cook fire. "Found evidence of similar schemes in 3 territories. The man's reputation is crumbling faster than autumn leaves." As the sun set that evening, an unexpected visitor arrived. Preacher Elias Booth trudged up the trail alone, his shoulders bowed under the weight of more than just his traveling pack. Grace found him standing uncertainly at the edge of camp, twisting his hat in his hands. "I've come to confess," he said, his voice thick with shame. "I took Denton's money, kept silent when I should have spoken truth. My conscience gives me no peace." Grace led him to a log by the spring. In the gathering dusk, the water's song seemed to soften their words. "We're all dry wells until mercy fills us," she said gently. "There's healing in honest words." The preacher wept then, releasing months of buried guilt. When his tears subsided, Grace handed him a cup of water. "Drink," she said. "Then help us tend to those who need comfort." That night, the first snow began to fall. Thick flakes drifted down through the firelight, melting as they touched the spring's surface. Families huddled close around their fires, sharing blankets and stories. Children who had arrived hollow-cheeked now slept with full bellies, thanks to Grace's careful rationing of their communal stores. Jacob moved among the camps, checking that everyone had enough firewood. He paused beside Grace, who stood watching the snow transform their sanctuary. "You've built more than shelter here," he said quietly. "You've built belonging." Grace thought of the widow, now helping to cook for others, the preacher reading scripture to the children, the former enemies who now passed bread between their fires like family. "God builds through willing hands," she answered. "We're just here to keep the spring flowing." All around them, Dozens of small fires dotted the hillside like earthbound stars. Their light reflected off the falling snow, creating halos in the darkness. The sound of singing rose from one of the camps, an old hymn about providence and peace. Other voices joined in, the harmony spreading from fire to fire until the whole hillside seemed to glow with both light and song. Grace closed her eyes, remembering that lonely night months ago when she'd first found this spring. How different everything seemed now, not because the challenges were fewer, but because they faced them together. Even the bitter wind seemed less fierce when shared among so many hearts warmed by mercy. The snow continued to fall, blanketing their camp in white. But beneath the frozen ground, the spring flowed steady and clear, a testament to grace that ran deeper than winter's reach. The mountain air held a sharp bite as Agent Henry Talltree dismounted his horse at the edge of Grace's camp. His leather satchel bulged with documents, and his eyes held a quiet certainty as he surveyed the scattered shelters and cooking fires. Grace met him by the spring, her shawl pulled tight against the cold. Jacob stood nearby, his forge-roughened hands steady on the handles of his work apron. "Mrs. Haskell Yoder," Agent Talltree said, addressing her with formal respect. "I've spent weeks investigating land claims in this territory." He drew out a weathered document, its edges crisp despite its age. "This filing caught my attention." Grace's eyes widened as she recognized her own signature, penned years ago when hope still ran fresh in her veins. "My maiden claim," she whispered. "Filed before everything," Agent Talltree nodded. "Your quarter section overlaps this spring and the surrounding 50 acres. He cleared his throat. "The claim was properly filed and never surrendered. By law, this land is yours. Has been since 1878. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Widow Hanley pressed her hand to her mouth. The preacher bowed his head. "All railroad deeds are hereby nullified," Agent Talltree announced, his voice carrying across the hushed camp. "Their claims were built on fraud, but yours stands true." Grace stood very still, her hand finding Jacob's arm for support. The weight of every mocking word, every stone thrown, every whispered insult seemed to fall away like autumn leaves in a cleansing wind. "The spring," she said at last, her voice clear and strong, "will remain open to all who come in need." She looked at the faces around her, faces that had once turned away in scorn, but now watched her with something like reverence. "But we'll share it in honor, not greed. That's God's way." Jacob watched his wife speak, seeing in her the quiet strength that had been there all along, waiting like the spring itself to be discovered. She had become more than a wife or a healer. She was living proof that mercy could transform both the giver and receiver. Spring flowers dotted the Wyoming plains as Rock Creek bloomed anew under God's grace. The townsfolk had christened the new stone-lined well Grace's Mercy Spring, its clear waters serving both settler and tribal families who passed through the valley. Where ash and bitter memories once lay, wildflowers now painted the earth in splashes of purple and gold. Children played tag around the old forge's foundation stones, their laughter rising pure and sweet as mountain air. Jacob's new blacksmith shop, built beside the spring, rang with the steady rhythm of hammers as he taught young apprentices the art of metalwork. The smoke from his forge rose straight and true against the blue sky, like prayers of thanksgiving. Inside her bustling kitchen, Grace moved with quiet joy, teaching young wives to bake with whatever the Lord provided. Her table welcomed all comers, ranch hands, traveling families, even members of the Northern Cheyenne who traded herbs and wisdom. The same folks who once mocked her size now praised her generous heart, though she deflected every compliment with a gentle smile. Sheriff Lyle, having found his own redemption, now served as lay preacher in the rebuilt church. His sermons often touched on forgiveness, his voice carrying special weight when he spoke of pride's blindness and mercy's sight. The wooden pews, crafted by Jacob's hands, filled each Sunday with souls hungry for more than just daily bread. On Sunday evenings, as the sun painted the plains in sheets of gold, Jacob and Grace sat together on their new porch. Their fingers intertwined, weather-worn and work-strong, while they listened to the sounds of their reborn community. Children's voices carried on the evening breeze, mixing with the gentle splash of water at the spring and the distant lowing of cattle. The church bell rang out across the valley, its clear tone bouncing off the hills like ripples in still water. Each ring seemed to speak of redemption, how love had transformed mockery into mercy, scorn into service, and bitter hearts into wellsprings of grace. Those who had once laughed at Jacob and Grace's unlikely union now drew daily from the waters of their faithful love. They had scorned what they couldn't understand until that very love became the well they drank from, deep and pure as the spring itself. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.